Well, hello everyone. Here we are again with the second installment of really what is our introductory lessons in art history. This one in particular is very important, and we're going to look at the language of art. So much of what we have to know and what we have to do is in describing different qualities about art. We call this formal visual analysis. And probably it's one of the hardest things for most people to do is to actually find a language in order to describe art. And once we find that language, once we really start an in-depth analysis of things like line and color and shape, then we're going to really begin to help. That's going to really help us reconstruct what the artist is trying to do, and therefore what kind of meaning we could see in that art. So we're going to go through this rather quickly. There are some additional readings that will accompany this, and a visual analysis exercise that you will have to complete. But this is a very good lecture to occasionally brush up on as you go through the year, and just to refresh on some of the finer points. First thing we're going to look at is line. I've actually copied a little page here, not the best quality, I apologize, from the Lazari and Schleicher text that really I think is very helpful. We could talk about different types of lines, actual lines that we see in art here. They can be either sort of irregular or very, very straight, but these are lines that are going to be very visible. So let's say an artist actually outlines a form, maybe very subtle, but there might be a line that outlines a form that then they use color, they apply color within those lines. Okay. Sometimes there are implied lines, dashed lines, broken lines, and so on. Okay. So they're not completely solid, whether irregular or irregular. We also talk about lines in terms of their direction, whether they are vertical or they're horizontal or they're on the diagonal. And of course, in most works of art, there's going to be a combination of all of the above. Okay? Line quality is another important aspect of this. Is the line jagged? Does the line flow? Another word for these flowing lines here we might call are curvilinear lines. Okay, and then finally we have certain qualities about them that go beyond that, mixtures of that. So we see down here different representation of feet here. Okay, this one, for instance, here is to depict the contours of the foot. These we see hatching, to indicate shadow on the foot, or cross hatching to really heighten the shadow. So, the artist's technique that they're using, the type of line that they're using, is going to be important in determining what exactly they're trying to depict, what effect they're going for, and then that will then translate into something as per its meaning. We've already sort of seen this in the way in which an artist can use line. That leads us into a discussion of the issues of light, value, and shadow. Value, sometimes called tone, refers to the levels of light that reflect off a particular surface. So we can see down here in this illustration different types of values, different values on this one sphere. Of course, we know that if light is coming from a particular area, it's going to create a visible light source. It's going to create a brighter spot, okay, a highlight on one area of the ball, and then as we recede from that light source, it will grow slightly more shadowy. Will grow darker until we get to the back side that's opposed from the light itself, and then you have a very dark hue. Okay, and then you have the shadow that is cast by the ball itself down here. Okay, different types of light value that we'll see. Achromatic, which will be like what we see in the example of the ball here, black, white, and gradations of gray. Of course, then we're going to see chromatic scales, where there's one color, and either that color is a lighter version or a darker version. Oftentimes, just go to a paint store and you'll see they'll have little cards, and you'll have a particular type of green, and they'll have that same green somewhat lighter, somewhat darker. Of course, for an artist that's trying to go for a naturalistic depiction, it's a question of sort of all of the above, and using shading or modeling. In the Renaissance period, this was known as chiaroscuro. And that's where you're going to see, let's say, a red toga. There will be lighter parts of red, darker parts of red, elements where it gets, it's mixed in with some black, which we would call shadow, okay? And so on. And that's what gives a greater degree of naturalistic behavior, because that's how we would see things in the real world. Fabrics, as they drape over things, are not going to be perfectly one color. In order to give it that sense of, a curtain with its little folds and so forth, there's different colors at play. Sometimes they're quite similar, and the effect will be very subtle, but nevertheless, it's there. More about color. Other more specific lines would be something like hue. That is the pure state of color on the color spectrum. That's a little bit hard because we see colors relative to other colors, but nevertheless, theoretically, that is the purest state of color. So that is the red that we'll see on the color wheel in a moment. Okay? Value, then, is added on top of that hue once we move out from the pure state of the color. It's the lightness or darkness of the hue. And there are two types of value. One is shade. Shade is any time that you add black to hue. Okay. Tint is whenever you're going to add white to the hue. Okay. Again, sometimes it's helpful to go to a paint store and see what they refer to as shades, and especially they'll talk about tints quite a lot in paint. Other modifiers, other adjectives that we can use to describe color, is its intensity. Is it bright? Is it dull or muted? Okay. Then there's a whole other range of colors. These are the low intensity colors, sometimes called neutrals. These are creams, tans, beiges, and so much of what we see in art is going to be these types of colors, especially kind of in classical art and so forth. Because that the softer backgrounds, these low intensity backgrounds, will really make figural groupings, for instance, depictions of people wearing different color clothes and so forth. That's what's really going to make them kind of pop off the canvas or the wall or whatever it happens to be, and it's going to really draw our attention to those more colorful items. There's two types of color systems that we can look at. One that's really more important. That's the subtractive color system. That's one that we'll be talking about the most. The additive color system, that's going to be something that, as we get into more contemporary art, more 20th century art that actually uses light to create it, to create the art. For instance, if an artist is working with neon, then we have to talk about the additive color system. But additive color means that when light is being emitted, like on your television set, adding colors creates a brighter or whiter light. In theaters, this same thing happens on stage. So if you bring up your reds, it'll be a nice dark, saturated, intense red, but then once you bring up your green lights to the same level of intensity or varying levels of intensity, you're going to get a brighter orange color. And if you bring up all of your primary colors, okay, you're going to get something that's almost white. Okay, you're going to get something that's almost white light. So that a lot of times, for instance, on stage, People will recommend, don't get white lights there. You can just add all these different colors together, and that will give you a white effect. Okay. The subtractive color system is that which artists typically use, particularly in paints, pigments. So that if you take, let's say if you take a red and you mix it with green, you're going to get a darker color. Okay? If you take a whole bunch of different colors of paint and you mix them together, eventually you're going to get sort of brown colors and even black. A lot of times there are artists who will typically not actually use black on canvas, because a pure black ends up looking like this kind of hole on the canvas. So instead what they'll do is they'll use, for instance, very dark, deep blues. Okay? And you have to look very, very closely at the canvas to see what color they're actually using. Sometimes it also depends on the other colors that are around it. That we call the relativity of color, which we'll talk about in a moment. But those are the really two types of color. One that uses light to emit color, the other that uses pigments and so forth. And we have a little schematic here that shows you exactly what happens there. So in an additive color system where we're talking about light being emitted, if you take that blue and you get some green in there, I think I misspoke a moment ago, you get a light blue, okay, or a lighter shade of blue. If you take the blue and the red and put it together, you get a kind of magenta color. Okay, but you see in the center where all those primary colors then overlap, you have white. Right? So that's where you can get your white light. As opposed to the subtractive or the pigment color system that we see on the right, where they all overlap tends to be a very sort of dark, sort of gray, brown, blackish shade that you get there in the middle. And where these colors overlap, there's a somewhat darker color that you see there. For instance, when blue overlaps with the magenta color, you get something more akin to a deep blue. It's a sky blue color. Much of this has to do with the color wheel and the relationships between colors on it. Now, probably when you were children, you learned about Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, blue, or green, blue, indigo, and violet. Those are essentially your primary and secondary colors. Okay, so for instance, you have here your primaries: red, yellow, and blue. Okay. However, if you take blue and yellow and add them together in the additive system, okay, you get green, and green is a secondary color. If you take blue, right, and you add red, you're going to get violet, which is another secondary color. Red and yellow, you get orange, another secondary color. So that pretty much makes up your Roy G. Biv for the most part. You know, the separation of indigo and violet. We're not going to get into that here, but that's really your primaries and your secondaries. The tertiary colors are when you add yellow to orange, you get a yellow orange. Okay, right, or red to orange, you get a red orange. Okay, so again, it's descriptive. It gives you a sense of the relationship between these. Analogous colors would be as we get into those colors which are next to one another on the color wheel. So for instance, the orange families here, or the yellows and greens over here. Okay, those are the colors that are next to one another on the color wheel. They are regarded as analogous. Whereas if you start to go across the color wheel, you're talking about the complementary colors. Okay, so red complementing green over here. These are, in a way, they're kind of opposites, but they also work well with one another. Yellow and purple next to one another In complementary colors, the yellow is going to look very yellow, and the violet's going to look very violet. Next, blue and orange next to each other, you're going to get a really good sense of what that blue is because it's next to an orange. However, if you pair that blue with a yellow over here, you're going to have different qualities. You're going to notice the blue in a different way than when it's next to its complement. In the same way that when you have blue and green next to one another like this, you're going to describe the intensity of that color differently because it's next to an analogous color. Okay? And that all goes to what we call the relativity of color, right? That it depends on how the artist mixes the colors, what particular color is next to another one on the canvas, how that color pops out or becomes more subtle because of the color scheme around it. Okay, and finally we talk about whether a canvas in particular is warm or cool. Warm colors typically over on this side of the color wheel over here, cool colors over on this side of the color wheel here. Right? So color that an image that's very lots of blues and greens. Think of in the last presentation we saw The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, right? Overwhelmingly blue, but it's also punctuated by some yellows. There's a coolness about that particular canvas. Whereas if we think back to the Picasso, the ladies of the women of Avignon, that tends to be coming mostly from this side of the color wheel. There's a warmth about that particular canvas. Then we come into the question of texture or pattern. These are variations in the surface. This has to do with, let's say, it's a painted surface. Is the brush stroke very smooth? Is it very thick, as it is in, let's say, Impressionist painting? So you could perceive that tactily because it's the smoothness or the roughness is with the touch. The same thing holds true, of course, with statuary. The breastplate of Caesar Augustus, for instance, is going to be all sorts of carving all over it. There'll be areas of smooth. His hair will be somewhat more rough. That's what we mean by tactile texture. Visual texture is the illusion on the surface. So let's say, for instance, it's a painting or it's a medieval bookplate where you have pattern that's there, that it's almost as if you could feel it, you would almost think of it as being somewhat uneven. Or if you looked at a painting of a woman wearing a dress, and the dress is of a coarser material, it's a tweed, they're going to use a particular effect to give it that texture of a somewhat rougher cloth. Or if it's silk, it'll have a shine to it. So that's the way in which they can use visual texture to give the illusion of that sort of tactile variation. Okay. Pattern. Pattern has to do with many of the similar things, right? There's repetition of visual forms. So let's say it's a geometric pattern that's going to be a very regular type of squares and triangles or circles or whatever type of geometry it might be repeating. Okay. Sometimes the Greeks used a geometric pattern commonly called the Greek key. We'll get into the more technical terms for it. To border their pottery. Okay. Natural patterns are going to be less linear, okay, fewer straight lines, and natural patterns are going to have a greater flow to them. So it might be a leaf pattern that's repetitive, or the pattern of grass, or the sea of waves. So it'll mimic that, and therefore be a little bit more flowing, let's say. And of course, pattern can be used to help convey meaning and direct your eye to important works. Down at the Princeton Museum of Art, which I hope we'll be able to see, there's a wonderful Roman floor mosaic that is largely a geometric pattern around the outside, and then has this, all that geometry directs you to the central image of Dionysus and Heracles having this kind of drinking contest. But there's this very, very elaborate border that's made with geometry that directs your attention to the central work. Shape and volume. What shape does a particular figure take? Whether it's a statue, or it's a bronze, or it's a marble, or even certain particular shapes, drawn shapes, painted shapes. Okay, the shape refers to a two-dimensional entity. Okay? And regular ones are geometric, irregular ones are organic, they're natural, okay, biomorphic, fancy term for that. Volume is adding that third layer, that third dimension. So volume can be just like shape, irregular or regular. And yet it also then it has this element of mass. Is it bulkier or is it less bulky? So for instance, if we go to kind of very two-dimensional medieval painting, wall painting, some Byzantine era wall painting. It's more two-dimensional. The figures in there don't really have volume the way in which they're drawn, the way in which they're painted, and so forth. But as we get towards the end of the Middle Ages, that's going to change, especially when, again, on painted surfaces, where artists are going to employ various techniques to denote the three-dimensionality of human figures, of columns, of buildings, of mountains and trees, and so forth. And that's going to give them more mass, more bulk. Sometimes we'll use the term plasticity. It means that it feels like seems like they're solid. Okay? Shape and volume. Space. How important. If you are a musician, you have probably heard at some point in time that not only is it very important to know what the note that you're playing, okay, is important and its duration, but also that the rest is quite important when you're not playing, makes rhythm. Okay, space is what allows an artist to set off the particular figural elements of their work. Again, regardless of what medium we're talking about. If you're carving a statue, you're Michelangelo and you're carving the David, there's going to be space. There's going to be space between his arms and the sides of his body, between his two legs, and so on and so forth. Right? That space is important. In painting, in particular, space becomes all the more important. How do you depict three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface? How do you get a sense of depth? Okay. We call this generally perspective. There's a few ways you can do that. One is probably one of the oldest forms of perspective. We'll see this actually in the few remaining Greek frescoes, the Greek paintings that we have, particularly the remaining Roman wall paintings that we have. Atmospheric perspective. If you've ever noticed this, and in the summertime it's very noticeable, if you look out on the horizon on a particularly, let's say, humid day, you'll notice that the mountains, the hills in the background look very blue. Okay? That's atmospheric perspective. Okay? They're a little blurrier, they tend to be a little lighter, and they tend to be greenish or bluish off in the background. Okay? Recessional space is a very generic term, and in the Middle Ages, but especially during the early Renaissance, there was a sense that images or figures in the foreground are going to be larger than those in the background. However, recessional space can be done with greater or lesser science and mathematics. So if it's just a question of you're trying to eyeball it, right, and put your figures in the foreground bigger and things get smaller in the back, but you're not being too fussy about it, then we can use the generic term recessional space. It still looks like it recedes. There is depth to it. But a scientific understanding of this is really when artists begin to apply the term linear perspective. And that's where Some of you might have encountered this when you were in middle school art classes. Vanishing point, a single instance where all, the point of your perspective, where all things sort of recede to that one area. It sits along that thing called the horizon line, and then we draw lines up to that, and through a very complex geometry and mathematical variations, we begin to see how figures can be positioned so that mathematically they are in a proper scale or relationship to one another. Okay? And there's several types of perspective. What I just described to you very briefly and very badly is one-point perspective, which we'll see over here. That's essentially what I was just describing to you here. Okay. We also have 2- and 3-point perspective. 2-point perspective over here and 3-point down here. Again, whenever we're dealing with geometry, again when we're dealing with different shapes, these things are going to apply. Okay. Let's look at 2 examples here. One is by Leonardo da Vinci, the other by Leonardo da Vinci. Right? He's employing 2 different types of perspective here. In the background of his very famous Mona Lisa, we see off in the distance things seem to get kind of blurrier. In effect, the whole style of this canvas is kind of blurry. That's the Italian term that's used for that is sfumato. It's kind of smoky. That he uses that here in the Mona Lisa. But as we recede into the background, whether it's real or in a way it almost looks like the kind of backdrop that you would go and have a photo taken of yourself in front of in the 19th century or something like that. Doesn't look like a real landscape, but as it recedes into the background, it gets sort of bluish and hazy. If we contrast that, and you might want to enlarge this a little bit more, of the image of the Last Supper, here we have a very good sense of where the horizon line is. This is the line that would be sort of parallel to you in the canvas. You would be viewing directly into the center here, which actually happens to be the head of Christ. And then you could see through the wall hangings here and the windows in the background, as well as the rafters on the ceiling, the orthogonal lines are being drawn. So we have a very scientific understanding of how this rectangular room recedes off into the distance, and it's very much based on the point of view of the viewer. And it assumes that the viewer's eye level is right here. Okay, so as you look in, this is what is at eye level. That has a lot to do with where this particular work is being placed and how it appears in situ, in its actual situation. And so therefore one would assume that, relatively speaking, that this would be about the height of the viewer. Okay, now we get into, well, some of those things were sort of the nuts and bolts of how particular effects are achieved. Now we get into looking at how a particular work of art, all together with line and texture and color and perspective and all these different things come together. We talk about composition, right? Balance and rhythm of a particular work. Okay. Balance. Is the work that you're looking at symmetrical or asymmetrical? Are there groupings on one side that are mirrored by groupings on another side of it, as we saw with the Last Supper, for instance? Or is the work asymmetrical? Is it, is there a lot of action going on in one place, and then there's a lot of space that's being created on the other? Does it radiate out from one particular area? Okay. If there are elements that are repeated throughout a work, let's say something is bordered, it has a border of some sort that we have to pay attention to. The artist is putting a border on there for a reason. Is there a regular rhythm to that border? Is there a regular rhythm to that carving? Okay? Or is there an alternating element to it? Okay? Does it go back and forth between 2 different type of rhythmic patterns? Is it eccentric? Is there seemingly no pattern to the rhythm? But even in some types of eccentric rhythm that we'll see, let's say in ancient Near Eastern art, there is a method to the madness, so to speak. Okay, but that's what we mean by balance and rhythm. Okay. More about composition, proportion, scale, emphasis. Okay. Proportion refers to the relative size of an element to another in the same work of art. Uh, Proportionality and perspective sort of go hand in hand. Okay. If linear perspective, or in one of its many forms, is not present, then we have to ask, why is the artist rendering one object in relationship to another? Is another type of scale, okay, this is the size of something in relation to what we assume to be normal, are they playing with that for a particular reason? If they're trying to be naturalistic or realistic, then you're going to look at the canvas and you're going to say, oh yeah, all right, that person standing there is the same scale as the person standing next to them, and so we would say, okay, that's pretty natural. That's what we assume to see in the natural world. If, however, we go into art that's more abstract, what artists will do is they will change the scale. So the relationship of what we think someone should be in real life to what they are on the canvas. And there's an ideology, there's a pattern of belief that probably goes behind that. So for instance, if we see Jesus being depicted as much larger than everyone else in the canvas or the carving or whatever it is, then we get a sense the artist is trying to emphasize, is trying to really draw our attention to the person of Jesus being the most important person in that work. Okay? And that gets into the next issue of emphasis, where the artist is trying to direct your attention in that particular work. And trying to figure out what the artist is emphasizing is really key. If they're emphasizing one element in particular, then that means that there's varying degrees of de-emphasis radiating out from that. Why are they emphasizing one thing and or de-emphasizing another? Okay. Lesser points are called accents. We can see that here, these two types of scale, naturalistic and hieratic or hierarchical scale. In this work by Perugino, we have a classic example of linear perspective. You can see the orthogonal lines of the tile floor of the walkways here, going back to this the vanishing point here, the very strong horizon line here, and then all of these individuals are being scaled according to that, right? Whereas over here with the ancient Egyptian work, the Narmer palette, this is the image of the pharaoh, and so therefore relative to all the other images or people in it, he's really, really big because he's the most important person there. So that's, and it wasn't because the ancient Egyptians couldn't do this. We can't necessarily conclude that because they have a different agenda. They wanted to depict things differently than the natural world. They're putting emphasis on there. And so yes, does that make this more abstract? There's a couple of reasons why this is abstract and not realistic, naturalistic. But that's abstract because they're trying to make a point that transcends a naturalistic depiction of it. Okay, there's a complex idea in there, and we'll encounter that throughout the course. Okay. And finally, we have the issues of unity and variety. Okay, so this is the kinds of things that in a formal analysis you'll be concluding your remarks with. To what degree are formal elements in a work of art? How much do they work together? Are they cohesive? Right? Are there differences? Does there seem to be something that's out of place that creates tension in the work? Well, that's important to look at too. If you perceive in your viewing something that something doesn't quite fit, why doesn't it fit? Chances are the artist intends it to create that tension. Why is that artist doing it? Okay. So this sort of pull and push of cohesion versus tension is going to be really important for you to pick up on as you go through the class. And then other things to consider. Why does the artist create the sense of unity? How does art impact our perception of the work? And finally, is there a mood as a result that the viewer might sense? Okay. If there's a great degree of cohesion and it's very harmonious, then the viewer might be relaxed about it. If it's very dynamic, if it's somewhat unbalanced, if there are lots of people in different poses, well then, you have to wonder, what's going on here? There's movement in it. Where are they going? What are they doing? And so forth. Okay. It might be more energized or energetic. Okay. If there's one individual on one side of a composition and a whole group of others staring at them from the other side, this unbalance here is creating tension. Okay, what is the artist trying to get at? Okay, so these are all of the types of things that you can consider as you look at a work of art, and it takes time. And I have a handout that will accompany this, and sort of again goes back over all of these particular issues. You want to look at that, and then as we start writing descriptions in a formal language, using formal language of the art historian, you can start using these types of terms. What type of line is the artist using here? Where is the light source coming from? How does that create shadow? Why is the artist creating shadow in that place? Why is the artist mixing up the scale? Why is this person seem so much larger than the other? Okay. What does it mean that the vanishing point is in that particular place? What impact do the color choices that the artist has made impact the overall mood of the canvas? Is it cool? Is it warm? Right? So again, watch this. You can watch it a couple of times if you are not too annoyed by my voice. Look at some of the other resources that I've posted online, and we'll get down to the tough work of doing visual analysis.